Thanks very much for coming in, Lew, and talking to us about an area that you've devoted a great deal of your time on over the years. Could you tell us a little bit about the topic of competitive anxiety?
Okay, yeah. So, well, if I start with anxiety, because competitive anxiety is just anxiety about competitions.
Sure.
And from generally in the sports psychology literature, anxiety is thought of as a bad thing.
Yes.
Although I wouldn't necessarily agree with that view.
Okay.
From an evolutionary perspective, it serves a very useful function.
Yes.
It's a warning, it's a threat detection, a warning mechanism. It says, you know, something's happening, you need to do something about it. And in that regard, it can be very helpful, very useful.
Obviously, yeah.
In fact, some work in, neurological work really, in psychiatry, by a very famous psychiatrist, Geoffrey Gray, identifies two neural networks, one of which is concerned with punishment, things to do with punishment and threat, and that's associated with anxiety, and another that's concerned with preparing actions and planning actions.
Right.
And really these two systems work together, and this is the warning system that says you need to do something here.
Sure.
So I view it as the jury's out from where I'm sat on whether it's a bad thing or a good thing.
Okay.
It depends what you do with it.
Okay.
And the effects of anxiety, well, I might say something just a little bit about causes first. So there's some early literature that shows that there are two different sorts of anxiety. You've got stuff that I'll call worry, that's basically thoughts, images, stuff like that. And then a physiological bit that's about butterflies in your stomach, sweaty hands, dry throat.
This is what the sports psychologists call cognitive and somatic.
Exactly,
Okay.
yeah. And you have these two different parts, and a bit that's frequently people don't draw attention to is that they're caused by different scenarios, different events. So the cognitive bit, the worry bit, is caused by ego threat. So in the competitive context, this is the Olympics, you've trained for 8 years, everybody knows you've trained for 8 years, this is going to be a really big event, there's going to be a lot of pressure. Are you going to deal with it?
Right.
And if you don't deal with it, of course, you at least feel bad, and probably you think other people think badly of you.
Sure.
And then there's a different sort of threat that's actually about physical harm and damage that could come to you. In some sports, that's very real. So, for example...
And that links to the evolutionary part.
Exactly, yes, yeah. And that bit is what causes the somatic response. So in sports, you have these two bits to varying degrees, depending on the nature of the sport.
Sure.
And each of those two bits may have a whole raft of quite complex, different mini effects, different effects on different aspects of performance, which is why it's the literature's, it's sometimes difficult to make clear predictions about what should happen.
Because sort of counterintuitively, sometimes certain kinds of anxiety, cognitive maybe, how would that affect performance?
Well, if I do an absolute classic one that's not in sport, there are countless examples that have happened over the years where you'll read of, mother's baby trapped under car, mother lifts the car up.
Yes.
Where on earth did she get that strength from? She could never have done that if it wasn't for the fear of physical harm to her baby. Now, that's not ego threat.
No.
And it's not physical harm to her.
Sure.
But there's something in that fear, in that anxiety, that generated a whole raft of stuff. And one of the positive bits that's associated with anxiety is the possibility of increased effort. From where I am sat, we all are capable of much more than we realise most of the time.
Sure.
And when we're anxious, if we can harness that and control it, then that can be a very powerful ally.
Sure.
And if we don't control it, it's a very bad enemy.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. I'm thinking as you speak of a friend of mine who, when he was doing military training was very, very tired, and then said, now climb that big hill with your pack on.
Yeah.
He used to imagine his children being held by somebody at the top of the hill.
Yeah, okay,
And
yeah.
got him up the
yes,
hill.
yeah, absolutely. That is the sort of thing. And of course, you know, athletes develop all sorts of strategies to deal with anxiety, make use of anxiety, control it, or whatever. Okay. Often that use visualization, imagery, self-talk, all sorts of things like that.
And do those techniques, do we have any scientific evidence that these things are effective?
Oh yeah, there's quite a lot of scientific evidence that they work to varying degrees. Typically, the easy evidence is there are lots of ways to reduce anxiety levels. Okay. And there's quite clear evidence on that. The cleverer stuff, for me, is not really about that. The cleverer stuff is about how do you make this work for you rather than just reduce it.
So how do you mean?
Well, there are studies that, you know, some recent studies that I've done that show fairly clearly that, well, some of these studies go back a lot longer than recently, actually. But if I describe an early one, this is it's quite classic, really. This, it's a study about what we call catastrophes in sport that are sometimes associated with anxiety. Yeah. And in this study, we showed that when people were anxious, their best performances were better than when they were not anxious, and their worst performances were worse than when they were not anxious.
Oh, interesting.
So then the question is, I mean, this is 20 years ago. So then the obvious question is, so how do you get them on this path rather than that path?
Sure.
And then more recent studies, we've shown that in people who are very experienced rock climbers, who, when you lead rock climbing, you climb above equipment that if you fall off, you fall the distance you are above it, below it, and then it holds you. Well, if everything works, And we showed in this study that people who were good at leading, people who were very good at leading, in other words, they could lead as hard or almost as hard as when the rope was above them. Right. And we compared them with people who were not so good at leading. They were still good climbers, but they could lead. They didn't lead as hard as when they were seconding, when the rope was above them. And what we found was that both of those groups had increased effort. They both invested increased effort. So the anxiety led to increased effort, but on the one hand, the increased effort was associated with less efficient performance.
Processing efficiency.
Exactly. And on the other hand, it was associated with more, well, at least more effective performance. Yeah.
Sure. How interesting.
So, you know, when you get further into that, then now as we go on this journey, so the evidence is getting weaker and weaker, and you get eventually, as in with all intervention work, you reach a place where you have to take educated guesses. Right. My educated guess, based on some evidence, but not such strong evidence, is that the perception of control is a critical variable. Right. So you can be quite anxious, but if you perceive yourself to be in control of the situation, actually you can make that anxiety work for you. You can perform better, not worse. And if you lack that control, then that doesn't happen. You get
and that suggests a bit of a different intervention to help people that this control variable.
Exactly. So, from my perspective, simply getting people to have lower levels of anxiety is missing out on a trick. Right. Because then all you do is you flatten everything. You don't have that opportunity of getting that better performance. Sure. Yeah.
Well, that's very interesting. Thanks so much for that, Lew.
Okay, you're welcome. Thank you.